Hello, you all hear me okay? Yeah. Perfect. Hello and welcome to a reading and Q&A with author Christine Silk and her book, The Dark Fire. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Catherine Sweezy and I'm the librarian here at Temple Sinai Reno. I would like to thank Mara Langer from Jewish Nevada for co-sponsoring this event with us. She's right there. Perfect. In addition, I wanted to thank Tommy Seidel in the back for setting up and manning the live stream and tech station this afternoon. Okay, our author today, as you know, is Christine Silk. Christine Silk is an author, copywriter, and editor. She earned her Bachelor of Arts in English at Binghamton University, a Master of Arts in English, and a PhD in rhetoric from Carnegie Mellon University. She has taught courses on writing, communication theory, literary analysis, and political philosophy. Her collection of short stories, Chase the Sun, was published in 2015. Her novel, The Dark Fire, was published in October 2024. Her website is christinesilk.com, and you can find her on Substack. Cool. I would also like to introduce our moderator. Tanya Naraki holds an MA in English Literature and is pursuing her second master's in Gender, Race, and Identity at the University of Nevada, Reno. Her current research explores the intersections of gender, sexuality, and race in 20th century middlebrow American literature, and her community engagement fosters dialogue while highlighting the need for nuance. She currently lectures in English, composition, literature, and women's studies. Thank you both for participating in today's discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
With that, I'm going to pass it over to Tanya because she has her own microphone, so I don't have to do anything. And we'll get started.
Thanks, Catherine. So my first question for you, Christine, is as I was reading this, I was wondering what inspired you to explore themes of Jewish identity throughout the novel. And I was also wondering if you could discuss how your research about Judaism and Jewish practice influenced your writing process.
So I'm going to take the first part first, which is why did I want to look at Jewish identity throughout the novel? So I'm a convert to Judaism. For 25 years, I was an atheist. I grew up Catholic. I was confirmed as a Catholic, and then I became an atheist for 25 years. And I like to think of that as the time when the slate kind of got wiped clean, and I was I didn't know it at the time, but it was in a sense a way of preparing me to convert to Judaism, which I think was ultimately what I was meant to do. My husband is Jewish. His mother was a Holocaust survivor, and obviously marrying into that family, the idea of what anti-Semitism is and the changes that Jews have had to make in their lives because of it was very real, because she escaped Germany when she was 9 years old with her sisters in February of 1939. And then her parents, fortunately, were able to follow like just a few months later. So her story, I always found to be really powerful. And when I converted to Judaism, I realized that I was taking on my shoulders a very serious responsibility as a Jew and as a person in this world where Judaism is not always welcome in all corners of the globe. Although I do think that in the United States, Jews have been treated remarkably well, like campus protests notwithstanding right now around the October 7th thing, which we'll talk about later. I was very much captivated by a book called The Golem of Prague. The golem is the creature in my story who is created out of the mud of the river. And originally that creature was created, according to legend, in the 1500s by a rabbi called the Maharal of Prague, Prague being in what we now know as the Czech Republic. And I found that story really captivating and super interesting. And I thought, wow, I'd really like to write my own version of this story. But I also combined it with the Dracula legend in kind of interesting ways. I think they're interesting because I think that the idea of vampires and who Dracula was and the charisma of a Dracula figure really fit in with some of the themes that I was just seeing, like, how do people, like a Hitler, for example, how does he get people to do what he wants them to do? His charisma, there's no question about it, but it's being used for such evil ends, such destructive ends. And so my character in the story, who is the main antagonist, he's the main bad guy, he's the Baron, he kind of embodies an anti-Semitism of the time that also goes back in time and combines it with a charisma that really does attract people around him. And that's one of the themes that I explore in the book, is how does that type of evil manage to bring into its orbit otherwise good people? So the second part of your question is, how did my research about Judaism and Jewish practice influence my writing? I had to understand Judaism from the inside, and I don't think I would have been prepared to write this novel 20 years ago. It took me about 10 years from the time that I came up with the idea, to the time that it was complete enough to actually launch as a novel. And part of that is because I was a full-time mom. Now my kids are all in their 20s, but for most of the writing of this novel, they were at home. And so I would write it, say, when they're at the orthodontist. I'd be waiting in the waiting room with my laptop and I would write it then, or they'd be in a music lesson, so I would be writing. And that was really good for getting the story out. But as you know, in writing, the editing is really key between a good book and a really good book, or a mediocre book and a good book. It's what you do with the material, how you edit it, that really, I think, makes a huge difference. So for me, living as a Jew was a super important inside, there was like an inside knowledge. It's like you start to absorb the rhythm of Shabbat, for example. And I describe Shabbat, that's the Friday night dinner where the Shabbat is coming, the seventh day God rested, and so we're commanded to rest. It's actually one of the 10 commandments that we as Jews have to observe the Shabbat. We have to cease from all of our labors. Our animals, servants, they have to also have that as a day of rest. And so understanding that rhythm helped me to really be able to shape my Jewishly observant characters in this story. And it also helped me to not make some mistakes. So, for example, about 25 years ago, I had written a story, a short story, not this one, but a totally different story with Jewish characters in it. And I had my husband read it, and I said, "What do you think?" And he said, "Well, you had one of the characters do something that Catholics would do. A Jew would never do this, which is get down on their knees and go like this and pray." He said, "A Jew would never do that." And I'm thinking, oh yeah, that makes sense. I guess he's right about that. So for me, being an observant Jew and raising our children Jewish and being married to a Jewish man did give me inside knowledge. But on the other hand, also having grown up in a Christian household helped me to shape my Christian characters who are in here. And so it's like I have a foot in both worlds. And that's why I feel in a lot of ways I am uniquely positioned to tell a story of this kind.
Thanks so much for sharing your writing process. On a personal level, I really appreciate it, as being in academia and a parent as well. So thank you. My second question for you is, I was wondering if you could discuss how Jonathan, one of your main characters, how his Jewish heritage informs his decisions and also his relationships throughout the novel.
Yeah, so do you think I should maybe read just maybe maybe just the opening page? Like maybe just the opening 2 pages to set up who Jonathan is and how he negotiates his Jewish heritage. So this is the very beginning of the book, and then I'll just give some quick insight. Jonathan Drake glanced at his gold pocket watch. 19 minutes past 4, time to go home. He gathered his things, put on his frock coat and top hat, and strode out of his office down the corridor to the front door. His clerk was nowhere to be seen. No matter, he'd see Mr. Dale tomorrow morning. Jonathan stood at the wrought iron umbrella stand that stood next to the front door and was careful to take the one that belonged to him, a Smythe Fenwick with an ivory handle that his wife had given him for Christmas. Jonathan felt a jostle as a man pushed past him without a word. "Good afternoon, Mr. Miller," Jonathan said in a tone meant to reprove the man for his rudeness. Miller stopped. He was shorter than Jonathan, and he looked up from under a hat brim that was too wide to be fashionable. A loose button dangled from his black overcoat. "Good afternoon, Mr. Drake." "In a hurry, are you?" "Not anymore," Miller said. "I've got nothing but time now. I expect I'll be given formal notice within days, if not hours." Jonathan was surprised that anyone at the firm would be stupid enough to do that. Miller might be a foreign Jew, but his work was impeccable. To let him go would be lunacy. "But why?" Jonathan asked. "Because I told Mr. Stoker I won't go to Klausenberg. The buyer of the Belgravia house lives there, and the papers must be signed before he can settle in London." Miller still had an Eastern European accent. Jonathan stared at him. "Why the devil won't you go? Surely a cosmopolitan chap like you enjoys travel." "I do not enjoy traveling to places where life is cheap, where people like me are killed for sport." "But I thought you were from there." "That's how I know what I'm talking about." Miller's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Stoker will request that you go in my place. I'd refuse if I were you." Jonathan sneered. "Well, I'm not Jewish, so I don't need to worry." Miller said quietly, "Are you certain?" Jonathan was stunned by the man's impertinence and wondered whether Miller was referring to the need to worry or about the question of Jewish heritage. There was no way this man could know such details. Jonathan had always been careful to never disclose more about his background than was necessary. Jonathan drew the gold watch from his pocket and showed it to Miller. "This belonged to my paternal grandfather, Sir William Cecil Drake, a knighted admiral in Her Majesty's Navy. It was given to him by the Duke of Marlborough. We English rule the world. Why should I fear some bounder in a backwater fiefdom?" Miller's face was grim. "Because blood runs just as red, no matter who wields the blade." This comment caught Jonathan off guard. He retorted, "They wouldn't dare harm a subject of His Majesty." Miller shrugged, clearly not convinced by Jonathan's reasoning. Then he asked, "Have you seen the Belgravia house?" "The one to be finalized? No, I've not seen it." "Evil place. Best to stay away." Miller turned abruptly and went outside into the rainy London afternoon. Okay. So Jonathan is part Jewish. His mother's Jewish. And you can see here there's an insider, outsider, and also class status going on because we're talking about Edwardian England, London in 1908. And Jonathan has done a really good job of just assimilating. His mother has assimilated. But there still is, even in his past, residues of heritage because he used to hang out with his Jewish grandfather when he was a kid. And he's very comfortable where he is now. But like a lot of adventure stories, the hero goes on a journey, right? And the journey causes the hero to change and have to re-examine assumptions because they're out of their comfort zone. That's exactly what happens to Jonathan. And when you read the book, what you see is that all the things that he thinks are super important, his family heritage, his status, the way he's thought of in society, the fact that his family is aristocratic, that all becomes, let's just say, not so important given the kind of challenges that he faces on his journey when he runs up against real anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe and has to confront the fact that who he is might not matter to him, but it does matter to other people who have another framework of looking at what does it mean to be Jewish and what does that mean then for how you're treated. Now, at this time in 1908, there had already been pogroms going on in the early 1900s. So it was very fresh in the history of that time, not so much in England, but definitely in Eastern Europe, which is where Jonathan is traveling to. And that's a theme that comes up time and time again, where the Jews are under threat and they have left. And that's what Miller knows firsthand because he's exactly one of those refugees from Eastern Europe whose family and life was threatened in one of those pogroms. Do you have a follow-up question or?
More of a comment. I appreciate your comment about when we talk about race and identity, and especially with Jewish heritage, you know, one might see themselves one way, but there's still this process of categorization that someone else can impose upon you. And I think Jonathan's a really excellent character to demonstrate that. And I think that you might want to touch on that in our next question as well, when we talk about how some of this remains relevant today. But did you have more readings before we move on to more questions? Or
I'm just trying to think of maybe I could do another reading. Let me see what I had told you that I thought might be an interesting passage. Let's see. I could read the scene where the golem is awakened. I mean, that really is the pinnacle of it. It is in some way, it's not really the climax of the story, but it's definitely building toward the climax. And I just want to set it up a little bit before I do that. The golem is a creature. It is really interesting because it's pretty new. Jewish literature is very old. It goes back about 3,500 years. Judaism is a very old religion, but the golem is a fairly new appearance on the scene that happened, like I said, in the 1500s with the Maharal. But even in the 1500s, it wasn't known for another 300 years after that about the golem story, because the manuscript that described creating the golem was lost for 300 years. And then it surfaced in the 1800s, or actually the late 1700s, and it started to be incorporated in Jewish legend and Jewish lore. And there's a lot of that because Judaism is a highly literate religion. Jews have been highly literate throughout history. Women, and both the women and the men. It's been customary to also teach the women how to read along with the men. It wasn't like you had in different times in Christian history where the church, it would just be the learned people who knew how to read. The common people didn't. In Judaism, pretty much everyone did if they had the chance to learn, and that was really stressed. So the golem legend started to appear, let's say, in the late 1700s and started getting going in the 1800s, and especially the early 1900s. And some people think that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was influenced by golem legend. They think that she may have heard about it because some of these manuscripts were starting to be publicized by Jewish publishers in Europe who wanted people to be aware of this. And since then, golem has become comic books, horror movies from Hollywood, video games, comic books. I think I said that already. So you can see that it's a very interesting, I don't want to call it a meme, but like a figure, like a prototype that's really taken off in literature around the world now, because the golem's interesting for a number of things, which I can get into later. But let me read the passage where the golem is actually woken up. So the golem was created in 1500s by the Maharal of Prague. He was the chief rabbi. And then the golem was put to sleep when he was no longer needed because the danger was past. He was put to sleep in a synagogue in Prague in the attic. I've seen that synagogue. We were not allowed to go up in the attic. There are legends that there was a rabbi in the 1700s who did go up there, and he came down. He was very frightened. And he said, yes, the golem is real. I saw him, in the attic there, and it's real, and he was very shaken up by it. So I don't know what to say. I have never confirmed it with my own eyes, but it's still a very romantic and interesting legend. So let me go to page 180 and see about that. So the men who are going to raise up the golem and awaken him have to go to the river to purify themselves, the Vltava River in Prague. They have to go there. In Judaism, it's what's called a mikvah. A mikvah is a ritual bath. It can be a natural body of water, and it can also be a constructed body of water in a synagogue. So, for example, when I converted to Judaism, I had to go into the mikvah 3 times. Only females were allowed to witness it, and they let the rabbis know that I had done the prayers and the immersion correctly. So these men go over to the river, they immerse themselves, and then they go to the old new synagogue where the golem is sleeping to get ready to wake him up. Okay, let me see. So after the river, they're making their way back into the city of Prague. The four men made their way back to the Jewish quarter of Prague. The hour was late, the streets deserted. Jonathan felt strangely renewed, as if he'd never need to sleep or eat again. The four men stopped at a side door of the Alt Neue Schule. That's Yiddish for Old New Synagogue. Rabbi Lev, he's the rabbi who's heading this whole thing up, unlocked it and then locked it again after everyone was safely inside. David lit a lamp. David is the rabbi's nephew. The rabbi led the way up an old staircase. David held the lamp high to light the way, making sure to be ready in case the old man lost his footing, meaning his uncle, the rabbi. Sam followed close behind. Jonathan was last. Sam is a medical doctor who is also Jewish, who's a part of this enterprise. At the top of the stairs, the rabbi fumbled for the proper key to the door there. Outside, the wind could be heard beyond the stone walls of the synagogue. David remarked, "The air was still when we walked to the Vltava, and now there is a storm coming in." A cold wind suddenly blew along the stairwell. Rabbi Lev asked, "The door downstairs is closed and locked, is it not?" "Yes," Jonathan replied. "I checked twice to be sure it was locked." "The unearthly forces follow us," the rabbi observed. Jonathan shivered and anxiously looked back down at the shadows of the stairwell, half expecting something to come up after them. He was reminded of the time that he and Mr. Cowles were at the house in Belgravia, climbing the stairs from the sinister cellar. Jonathan wished he were back at the rabbi's house where it was safe. Rabbi Lev found the correct key. The door was now unlocked, but the rabbi could still not open it. David had to put his shoulder to it and push with all of his strength. It creaked loudly as it swung open on its hinges. The four men made their way into the room. A small circle of light was cast by the lamp that David held. The wooden beams of the roof were festooned with cobwebs. Most of the place was deep in shadow. As Jonathan's eyes adjusted, he noticed that there was a pile of what looked like rubbish, old books and tattered cloth, not far from the window. The rabbi made his way to the pile and motioned for the other three men to wait nearby. "This is a geniza," David whispered, gesturing to the pile. "It's a depository for old holy books and manuscripts that are no longer in circulation." Rabbi Lev took a book out of his pocket and began reading Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 in Hebrew. His voice was drowned out by thunder and by the sound of wind blowing across the roof. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room in ghostly shades of white. Rabbi Lev continued. After some time, the rabbi stopped reading. He moved close to the other three men and in hushed tones instructed each of them in the proper recitation of the divine formula in Hebrew. David went first, circling the geniza 7 times clockwise and then 7 times counterclockwise, reciting the formula as he paced. Sam was next, circling exactly 7 times in each direction while reciting a slightly different formula. When Sam was finished, it was Jonathan's turn. The rabbi helped him to recite the Hebrew words. A strange sensation came over Jonathan. As he circled, he knew he was in a trance, but his mental and emotional state was unlike anything he'd ever experienced before. He felt a profound sense of peace, as if all the trials and fears of the last several months were as insignificant as a speck of dust on the floor. That was the most amazing part, the absence of all fear and the absence of all worries and anxieties about what had been and what was going to be. Time didn't exist. He could have been circling for a minute or for a year. He was simultaneously outside of his physical body while being one with everything around him, from the cobwebs strung across the rafters to the knots in the floorboards to the flame of the lamp that was now in the rabbi's wrinkled hands. There was no meaningful difference between him and everything around him. He was one with it all. Rabbi Lev put his hand on Jonathan's arm and gently drew him away from the perimeter of the circle. Jonathan took his place next to David and Sam, not wanting to break the spell. The rabbi began to circle the pile of discarded books and documents, the geniza, while reciting another prayer. A faint glow emanated from the pile of old books and manuscripts, as if lit from within. By the time Rabbi Lev was finished circling, the glow had intensified and the storm was at the height of its fury. A gust of wind shattered the window pane and extinguished the lamp. David searched his pockets for a match to relight it. As he turned so that the lamp was protected from the gusts, he touched the match to the wick and the flame once again illuminated the room. The pile heaved. Books and manuscripts tumbled to the floor, their pages blowing about in the gusty wind. A figure sat upright. It was shrouded in a talit, a prayer shawl with fringes, and its face was hidden by another talit wrapped around its head and shoulders. Okay, so that was the golem who just sat up. Yeah.
I love that you talked about the golem myth, but it also reminded me about the first passage that you read us about Jonathan and Miller. And I was wondering if you could talk about any connections you might have made between the anti-Semitic trope of the blood libel and then also vampirism.
Yeah, that is such a good question, because that was something that I want to turn onto. So let me just catch people up who aren't familiar. The blood libel is a very, very old libel that says that Jews would catch and kill Christian children and put their blood in the matzah at Passover, the matzah being the unleavened bread that Jews eat at Passover. Blood libel actually goes back to early Christianity. Early Christians were accused by pagans of cannibalism and drinking blood as well. I mean, it's a common accusation that people want to make against their enemies. But Jews in particular, that libel has been around for a really, really long time and has been a very serious accusation because it has led to uprisings against local Jewish communities. The pogrom, a pogrom is an attack, a slaughter of a Jewish community. And a lot of times it was incited by the idea of that this is what the Jews are doing, but it's unfounded. It's a total lie. And in fact, when the Maharal of Prague first created the golem, that was the main reason, because there was an evil priest named Thaddeus who was spreading the blood libel among the people of Prague and trying to get them to annihilate the Jews. And it kind of reminds you of the Purim story of Esther, Queen Esther, who had to save the Jews by convincing her husband, the king, that in fact the Jews are not trying to overthrow the king, and they're not this evil force. So that idea of the Jews always having to convince the non-Jewish larger population that they're not out to do evil has been a theme that's been around for a really long time. Now, talking about the blood in particular, the consumption of blood is completely forbidden in Judaism. If you go back to Torah, the Torah is what Christians call the Old Testament. Time and time again, God talks about you can eat animals, but you may not eat the blood of the animal. You have to make sure that the blood is poured out into the ground, because the blood is the life force of the animal. It cannot be consumed. However, when you're talking about vampires, and there is a Dracula theme to my story, blood does figure in the book because there are some bad characters who do consume blood, but the blame gets put on the Jews, right? And this is something that does come up in the book, which is that the Jews are blamed for, let's say, certain people disappearing and the blood being taken away, when it's really not the Jews doing it. It really is some people who consider the consumption of blood to be an important rite. And in fact, it is an important rite in some religions. And if you think about in Christianity, the consumption of the blood it's a symbolic thing through the wine, but it does figure very strongly in Christianity. And it's not a knock on Christianity. I'm just describing in a very neutral way why it is that blood consumption does have what I think is a powerful spiritual component to it. But that is something that is completely forbidden to all Jews. There's just no question about it. The idea of blood, I wanted to just talk about the idea of blood. You mentioned the word race, and I want to really put that in the context of the Jews as a people. For me, and we can get into this discussion at some point. For me, race is a very 20th century concept. Jews are a people, it's a nation, it's an am. And what I mean by that, it's kind of like the way that Americans are a people. It doesn't really, to me, it doesn't make sense to talk about an American race, because anyone can become an American. I have, my family ultimately came from Europe and immigrated here and became American because they, adopted the culture. It's the same thing with me being a Jew. I grew up as a Catholic, but I've joined the nation, the people of Jews, of Israel because I chose to take that on me. I went through the conversion process. So now that's my nation, that's my that's my people. It's not really a race. Like if you've ever been to Israel, you'll see that, you know, half the people are from the Middle East or Africa, and they do have brown skin. It's not like we think of like the Ashkenazic Jews of Eastern Europe who are very fair, but that's not how people necessarily appear when you're in Israel itself. So there's a sense of nationhood that transcends just physical characteristics. But the idea of blood is very, very important to a guy like the Baron, who's my main bad guy in here, because he thinks of the importance of blood. And this was a really important Third Reich Nazi concept, this idea of blood and soil. I'm sure you've heard that phrase before, the idea of blood and soil, about racial purity, about eugenics. There was that whole idea that you really focus on, you know, biological facts and blood heritage and inheritance of people. And that's what made it kind of scary, because for a lot of history, Jews could escape a terrible fate by just converting. But in the Third Reich, just converting wasn't enough, because it was seen that their very blood was tainted. It was a blood concept, and there was really nothing that a Jew could do to rectify or redeem themselves in the eyes of the people who bought into Nazi ideology. And so that was a really interesting departure. It's like you're just as a Jew, in the eyes of the Nazis, you're just damned, and that's just too bad. And the only solution was the final one, which is what they tried to, you know, obviously impose upon the world. And I do foreshadow some of that in the book, and I do explain it in more detail about, you know, how that whole idea of blood just kind of keeps getting played off and keeps cropping up.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that leads well into my final question, and I want to make sure the audience has time to ask questions. But I was wondering what ways the dark fire connects to some contemporary issues, and do you think it has relevance to alliance building that we see going on today?
Yeah, I really want to talk about the alliance building, because especially preparing for this, I've been thinking a lot about this. So I completed the dark fire before October 7th happened. And even though dark fire was published about a year after October 7th, which was, as you all know, it was the horrific attack that happened in Israel on October 7th of 2023. The book was really written by that point. At that point, what needed to be done was, you know, like graphic design, layout, cover design, you know, proofreading, blah, 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 which really always takes longer than an author wants it to. So I've always felt a really strong alliance, especially being an American living in the United States and having come from a Christian background. I do feel that there is an alliance among Judeo-Christian people, because I've seen it up close, like I've seen it firsthand. I mean, I didn't grow up with anti-Semitism in my family. It just was not a thing that was taught to us. Like, Jews were Americans like other people. Like, nobody cared in my Catholic family, because we were a working class family. And the thing that really counted is, how good of a neighbor are you? And are you just working hard and doing what you got to do and taking care of your family and taking care of your neighborhood? That's really what it was about. And I always appreciated that, because I think that it speaks to a kind of multiculturalism in the United States that allows people of different faiths and different backgrounds to come and be Americans together, even though they're from different parts of the world and different backgrounds and different ethnicities and religions and that kind of thing. So in the wake of October 7th, 3 people reached out to me, and I was really touched. One was a Hindu friend of mine, another was a Catholic relative, and another was a Protestant friend of mine. And each of them called me up or texted me and said, "You're probably really upset about what had happened. You know, if you need to come stay with me, if you need to talk, I'm here." And I really appreciated that. I felt that October 7th really showed who was where with regard to Jews. Like, who would be the people that I would be able to count on, let's say, if this were all magically transposed to 1939 Germany. And by that time, my book was already written, and I already written about the interfaith alliances between Christians and Jews to fight evil, which is a theme that's very prominent in my book. There's a scene pretty early on where Jonathan is in Budapest, and he's in Klausenberg. I'm sorry. He's in Klausenberg, and he's taken to a synagogue with a Jewish cleaning lady who cleans the synagogue, and her friend who helps her to clean, who's Christian, and they urge him not to go to the Baron's estate because they know he's a bad guy, and it's just going to be not a good idea. So the Jewish woman gives him a mezuzah, which is it's the parchment scroll that goes on the doorpost, and it's portion from the Torah. And so observant Jews have a mezuzah on their doorposts around their house, not just the front door, but back door, whatever, sometimes room to room. And the Christian cleaning woman gives him a crucifix. So for me, that was a symbolic alliance of, two people coming together to try to protect this third person who is a stranger. They didn't owe him anything, but they felt this biblical obligation to not oppress the stranger, which is another commandment, in Torah. And they wanted to try to help him. Well, of course, he discards their advice, which is a good thing. Otherwise, I wouldn't have a novel here. But for me, that alliance was it just resonated with what my own life experience has been in terms of just meeting really good people of all faiths who we agree about what we believe is evil and the need to, stand up to it and to protect what we all agree is good. And I think that that's a really important thing. And when I lived in Los Angeles, I was a member, and I still am actually, I zoom in sometimes, of a Torah minyan that also includes some Christians who are very supportive of Israel. And they're just members of the minyan because they just want to worship with Jews on a Saturday. And I think that's a really beautiful thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I think now we have time for the audience to ask some questions. Catherine, do you want to facilitate?
I've got a microphone for when for if anyone has a question. Any questions for Christine? It doesn't have to be about the book.
Christine, I was fascinated that Judaism I always thought it was like a nationality and a religion. So, and you're saying that it is not?
Well,
I had a debate with a Jewish friend.
It's a huge debate. Yes, I think it can be both. I think an Am can be a nation and a people. Again, getting back to the United States, it's a nation. United States is a nation. It's also a people. It's like if you're an American and you have to transfer overseas to live and you haven't given up your citizenship, you're still an American. And even sometimes Americans who do give up their American citizenship and become, let's say, a part of another country, sometimes you can just tell that they're just American. So it's a very knotty question. I mean, a very knotty problem, I should say. Knotty in the sense of there's not an easy answer, and there has been a lot of debate on it. But I just want to say I do see it as an Am, as a people, not really as a race. Like for me, the blood issue isn't really what it's about. Like my bloodline, well, I've never had 23andMe done, but as far as I know, I don't have like Jewish blood, whatever that means. Like for me, that concept doesn't really make sense. And, you see in Torah itself that you have righteous people who help the Jews at very key points. Like when Moses, when in Egypt, when the Pharaoh said all the firstborn male babies have to be killed, the two midwives, Shifra and Puah, allow the Moses to be born so that he's not killed. They actually lie to the Pharaoh because the Pharaoh says, why didn't you kill this baby? And they say, well, it's because these Jewish women, they give birth so quickly, we didn't even have time to do any of that. So you see in, going way back to biblical times, that Judaism does recognize, the allies and people of other faiths who do come in and who do help the Jewish people at key moments.
Thank you.
Mara's there.
Oh, you have a question?
So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Mara Langer. I'm the Director of Community Engagement for Jewish Nevada, and I've partnered with Catherine and the Sinai libraries today, and just want to reiterate the thank yous. I have two things. First, I want to just touch on what your question was a little bit. What I like to say is that I am born American and I'm a proud American, but I'm also a proud Jew, right? And I think because of the history of the Jewish nation going through the exile from Israel into the diaspora, what we call the diaspora, a lot of us would say that we're a Jew first and then our country second, right? Often because of how that country has embraced or not embraced the Jewish people. And so back to Jews being a nation of themselves I think that that's a great summary of that, is that no matter what, we rely on each other, if that makes sense. And then there's the historical religious piece of it as well that takes us through the centuries.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And what you're saying reminds me of my mother-in-law's family was a wealthy textile manufacturing family in Stuttgart, Germany. They saw themselves first as Germans. That's how they saw themselves, and secondarily as Jews. But the Third Reich didn't see it that way. My mother-in-law told stories of where she was there for Kristallnacht. That was the night of the broken glass, when Jewish storefronts and houses and windows were just broken all over. They were just smashed up. It was like a riot. It was smashed up by the bad guys in Germany at the time. And she was also there when I think it was the SS came. It was Nazi soldiers came to the house to look for firearms, and they insisted on searching the entire house. And her sister got mad at one of them for pretty much turning her bedroom upside down. And the servants, of course, were scared. They had servants, and they said, there's no guns here. Why are you doing this? And we're following orders. We have to search your house. And so it was a real shock for her family, because here they were, pillars of the community, providing a lot of jobs, high social status, a lot of money, and yet the political situation turned against them and changed to the point that that's not really what they are. That's not what's important. What's important is the fact that they're Jews and something needs to be done about them. And the fact that they were able to escape is really a miracle, in my view.
Thank you for sharing that personal story. I also have a question, and I don't mean to put you on the spot at all, but when you're talking about your upbringing and your Catholic life and middle class life, I'm curious, how many Jews did you come across in your upbringing? Because you're saying like it wasn't.
Oh yeah,
really,
so at school,
a lot of people might not. I'm not trying to like.
No, that's fine.
Say, like we didn't. Everybody was welcome, everything, but then I never met a Jew until I went to college or something.
No.
I'm just curious how that influenced your family's outlook.
So I remember, so there was a guy who was a very kind man. He owned a grocery store nearby. He was Jewish. We knew it. We didn't care. I had friends starting in high school, not so much in grade school, just given what part of town I was in, because at that time, things were kind of like the city was kind of segregated according to what nationality you were, and my family was Italian. So we mainly lived in the Italian section, although that section changed over a lot, and now it's not that way anymore. Things are way more mixed and okay. But yeah, like we knew Jew, like my mom, before I was born, she worked at a jeweler's, and the man was Jewish, and she adored him, and she always had high praise to say. So nobody none of my family ever said, oh, look out for the Jews and, saying any kind of nasty stereotypical thing. I mean, granted, at Easter time, the priest would read from those passages where Christian scripture says that the Jews killed Jesus. Okay, I'm not going to debate that point. I'm just going to say that's what was read in church. But then when the priest would step up to give his homily, one of the priests, all he wanted to do is tell the congregants how sinful and bad they are and how they needed to give more money in the collection box. That was invariably what he talked about. He didn't talk about the Jews. And then the younger priests who would take his place, it was post-Vatican II. They were pretty like kind of hippie, kumbaya, let's hold hands, love and peace. How can we bring more love into our lives? So none of the priests that I grew up in the parish ever talked about Jews or Judaism or anything. I mean, the scripture was read and then it was set aside and they had something else that they wanted to talk about. So.
Any other questions or comments?
Hi. So getting back to the book and the characters in the book, and full disclosure, I have not yet completed the book and I'm a very fast reader, but it was just given to me by my good friend, and I'm having a great time reading it. But the transformation of Jonathan from a very aristocratic Christian Londoner to this observant Jew, and he's putting on tefillin and praying in the morning in front of his very Christian wife, and she doesn't understand any of it. Was that, when you built that character, was it specifically, his transformation was specifically because of the experience that he had? Because it doesn't come across to me as something that really changed within him. It was almost kind of jarring that suddenly, because people were attacking him because of his heritage, that he changed his behavior, if you understand my question.
Yeah, so the way that I would approach it, thank you. It's a really good question and it's a very insightful question. I would say that part of what he was doing was following the rabbi's instruction to him to put on the tefillin and to pray. As the author, I don't see it, and you can differ, like each of you readers can just disagree with me because your own reaction is your reaction. I'm not going to second guess that, but I don't think that he was actually changing on the inside and becoming a Jew. He was doing what the rabbi asked him to do because there could have been a protective effect for being able to pray and put on the tefillin. And I kind of almost mean it, I do mean it in a supernatural way, because as I mentioned in the novel, even just having a mezuzah on your door has a talisman effect. There's an effect that it keeps out the evil spirits. And this isn't just traditional Jewish thinking. It is traditional Jewish thinking, but also in history, Christians thought that maybe the mezuzah has a protective effect, and they wanted to put it on their doors too. So there was a debate in certain Jewish communities, like, should we let Christians do this? This is really a Jewish object, like, what are the boundaries? Is this really the right thing to be doing? Like, this is a very serious issue, especially in cultures where the unseen forces and the occult and the supernatural was taken very seriously. There were times in say Eastern Europe and Germany where it was believed that kosher wine had protective effects, that it had health promoting effects because there was something holy about it. I'm not going to dismiss that as stupidity, because if people believe that it can have that effect, then it can have that effect because the placebo effect is a real thing. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. It was just interesting that, do I really need this? I'm gonna Oh, okay. Thank you. It was just interesting because, for example, I remember the part where he's going to purify himself at the mikvah at the river, and which has a lot of emotional connotations for a lot of us. But that in the book, you did have him express his hesitancy about, why do I really have to do that? And then fairly soon after that, when he returned to his home in London, he had already adopted some of the more traditional practices. And so, yes, if it was because of his wanting to oblige the rabbi, so to speak, that kind of makes sense. But it does come across, it came across to me as kind of his wanting to for him having transformed a little bit. But maybe it's just because, you know, you read it part by part, and then you suddenly remember what this character was 30 pages ago or something.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of complexity, and I realize that. I mean, it's 435 pages long, the entire book, and so it's about 150,000 words. So it does qualify as an epic novel, epic in the sense of being long and, you know, and big. It's a big novel, and so there is a lot of layer of complexity, and I want to really get into a lot of the psychology. I mean, one thing I didn't touch on is like the idea of a psychopath, which is what the Baron is. Like, what does that mean? And one thing that it means is the Baron is about breaking down boundaries. He's always testing the boundaries. He's always violating boundaries. Judaism, on the other hand, is a religion that's about boundary. It's about boundary. It's about separation. You know, in the book of Genesis, God separates the waters above from the waters below. There's separation. There's boundary. There's, you know, there's certain things you don't do on Shabbat. I mean, there's just, that's really what Judaism is about. It's a boundary. It's about property. The Baron is opposite of that. Like when he says he is an enemy of Judaism, he really means it, because he is breaking boundaries and also his cruelty. And that was another thing I want to mention about the October 7th. The cruelty thing that the Baron's motto, his personal motto is, cruelty is just another word for strength. Well, we saw that in the October 7th attacks, where they were advertising what they had done to not just adults, but to children and babies as well. And that was seen as a point of pride, because that cruelty was seen as strength, that was seen as a good thing. And that's really the opposite of what Judaism teaches. So setting up the Baron against the ideas of Judaism was a really important, it was a really important contrast for me to get that right in the book. I hope I succeeded, but I worked really hard on that.
I have a follow-up thought, because I was also raised Catholic. Do you think that he became more observant of these Jewish traditions because the rabbi is in a position of authority? And when I was Catholic, it seemed like if the priest tells you to do something, you do it. You just don't ask questions, you just do it, which seems very different from my husband, who was raised Jewish, is experience with people of authority. They can question people telling you to do stuff. So I guess I haven't also read the book, but you always listen to your mother. But I was just curious if that's if that's part of why he became more observant.
So I think that what your insight is could be valid and it could hold up. The way that I see it is that Jonathan was through a very traumatic experience dealing with the Baron in Eastern Europe. It was traumatic. And I don't want to get into the details of how, but it was. I mean, if you've read the book, you know he went through a lot. We have the benefit of understanding trauma better than we ever have in any time in history, because there have been so many advances made in psychiatry and psychology for understanding how trauma affects not just people psychologically, but also physically. There's like a whole psychological literature, which is fascinating. I've read a little bit of it, and I've read enough of it to know that thinking about Jonathan's desire to do what the rabbi says comes out of a way of healing trauma. That's the way that I see it, because the rabbi, he was a refuge for Jonathan, right? Jonathan was told, go to the rabbi's house because this is going to be safe. And in fact, there's a point where I mentioned where Jonathan does feel really safe at the rabbi's house. He feels like the forces of darkness that are outside in the city of Prague can't penetrate the walls of the rabbi's house and get to him. So he feels really safe there. So for me, as the author, I feel like it's logical then that he would do what the rabbi advises him in terms of praying, putting on tefillin, putting the mezuzah on his doorpost, and, you know, just trying to do what the rabbi said, because it becomes a way of healing, not necessarily because Jonathan wants to become, you know, this super Jew like his grandfather was, but because he just wants a way of soothing the pain that he feels and trying to get away from the nightmare that he had lived through and try to pick up the pieces of his life and carry on with, you know, with his family and his friends in London.
Thank you. Oh,
When I've been reading the Vienna Blood series of mysteries, and that's set in the 1890s, and I keep wondering, can one write about European Jews knowing what's coming, knowing that in 1939 they become hunted in their own homes? Is it possible to just write about the time, or is that always what is the poem that says, "At my back I always hear time"? Was that Yeats or something? So can you separate a story?
Yeah. So I do foreshadow and prefigure World War II in this book, and I drop hints. The Baron talks about meeting an Austrian painter who is a charismatic young man with fascinating eyes. And who's he talking about? That's Adolf Hitler, but I don't mention Hitler by name. But World War II is being prefigured in this book. But I also wanted to kind of be true to the times as to what was really going on, because history hadn't been written yet. I mean, we know, so this book is happening right before World War I started. Winston Churchill said that World War II was a continuation of World War I for a lot of historical reasons, which we don't have time to get into. But I really tried to kind of take an approach where I know what's coming as the author. And this is the tricky thing about being a history writer. You know what's coming, but how much spoiler do you want to put into it? And do you want the history that you're writing then to be taken over with what's going to happen in the future, even though your story is not in the future yet? So that's why I kept it kind of as like a foreshadowing.
I'm sorry, I haven't read your book yet, but you said something that is sticking with me, and I was just wondering what you think. You said growing up, when you went to church, the priest on Easter would read how the Jews killed Christ. Don't you think that perpetuates anti-Semitism if this is going on? You know, how can the other priests say, "Oh, treat everybody well," when the priest is reading that the Jews killed their God?
Look, it's a huge debate. I know it's a huge debate among Christians. I don't know what to say, except to say that what I've seen among American Christians, and my whole family is Christian. I'm like me, my husband, my kids are the only Jews in my side of the family. My husband's side is Jewish. I cannot explain how it is that I believe okay, let me back up for a second. I didn't grow up Jewish. I've never been a victim of anti-Semitism in the United States. And look, I'm wearing a chai. Sometimes I wear a Magen David, the Star of David. I have not experienced that. It is not to say that Jews in America haven't, because I don't know what other people's history is, and I know it has happened. I think it's remarkable what I've seen among American Christians, which is that despite whatever the Christian scripture says about the crucifixion of Jesus, there's the sense that, hey, look, we're just all Americans anyway. It's like the way that atheists are treated just fine. I know I was an atheist for 25 years. It used to be that atheism was a serious problem in certain times throughout history. Like, it was considered apostasy, very seriously bad apostasy, because you're denying the existence of God. But in my 25 years as an atheist in the United States, nobody really cared. Although I do have to say, I didn't tell my Italian grandmothers who would say the rosary every day, because I didn't want them saying, honey, what the hell is wrong with you being an atheist? What does that even mean? Like, I knew I would just hear it from them. So I never talked to them about it. But just in the day-to-day, when people would know what my views are, I didn't get attacked for it. I mean, people would want to debate me, but we could be friends afterwards. So maybe I just chose good partners to debate with. I don't know. I hope that answers your question. I don't know what else to say.
So I'm Protestant and grew up in a very religious Christian household. And yes, in the New Testament, it says that the Jews, but Jesus said, forgive them, they know not what they do. And it wasn't our place to judge Jews. I also grew up in a Christian household, but there was no anti-Semitism that I picked up on or grew up with.
It's just like also I grew up Catholic too, and it is just part of the story you read, you know. But I didn't ever relate it to today. But I also didn't grow up around a lot of Jews, so maybe. But yeah, I didn't feel that in any sort of way. I don't know if that helps. Any other questions? Perfect. Thank you all so much for attending
Thank you, everyone.
our discussion, and thank you again to Christine and Tanya for participating in the discussion. We have snacks and books in the library, so please head on there as soon as you're done. Sorry, one more thing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Proceeds from today's sales will go to Jewish Nevada and Temple Sinai. So thank you again.
Thank you. Okay, let me shut this off so the battery doesn't get all worn.